I think that it was a very wise decision to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Centesimus Annus. And there are many reasons. Let me only mention one specific reason. Because we know that Centesimus Annus is a watershed. In other words, it's an encyclical closing the cycle of modernity, that modernity which was started with Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII, and at the same time opening the new phase of Catholic social teaching. And there are many points which would deserve, let me only take one. The great merit, in my opinion, of John Paul II was that of having relaunched the Catholic social teaching at a time when the Council, Vatican II, had reduced its practical, let's say, relevance. And there is a significant test to prove this. And that has to do with the notion of common good. As we know, in Gaudium et Spes was given a definition of common good. Just to quote a few words, common good is the set of those conditions of social lives, etc., etc. In other words, common good was conceived as a mean, not as an end in itself. And it was John Paul II who made the major change. If we read the compendium, which was published in the year 2004, under the pressure of John Paul II, we find at number 164 an altogether different definition of the common good, where common good becomes an end in itself to be pursued by societies or any community, etc. But let me, as we know, the grand theme of Centesimus Annus was twofold. One was to the analysis of the deep causes of the collapse of the Soviet regime. And the other one has to do with the clarification between the notion of a market economy and the notion of capitalistic economy. And that is a point which, in my opinion, deserves even greater attention in these days. As far as these two topics are concerned, let me mention that in November 1990, a group of 15 economists from different parts of the world were gathered in Justice and Peace, because in those days, the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences did not yet exist. And in fact, it was founded by John Paul II after the publication of Centesimus Annus. And in that occasion, Professor Jeffrey Sachs was one of the 15. And in that occasion, he published the book which came out of the meeting. He gave a paper whose title is Transition from a Planned Economy to a Market Economy. I'm sure that Jeffrey has remember still his presentation. No, it's here, Jeffrey. You can have a look. But let me fix my attention now in a few minutes on the res nove of the period which separates today from 1991. In other words, what has changed and which deserves our attention today? First, the political system has not been able so far to modify in a significant way the financial institutions responsible of the present crisis. That is a fact. Under these conditions, there is no guarantee that in the near future, another bank and financial crisis will not occur. Let me quote a recent speech by Claude Juncker, who is the president of the European Commission, which is revealing of what I'm saying. He said, we all know, we politicians, we all know what should be done, but we do not know how to be re-elected if we do it, unquote, which is a very simple expression of that phenomenon which has been called short-termism. And that is something new, because for centuries, politics was not considered a human activity aimed at a short run, but on the opposite to the long run. And in this regard, it seems to me that has become urgent to move some steps toward the new Bretton Woods to fix the rules of the economic game. Of course, people sometimes object, but why in 1944 the Bretton Woods Agreement was achieved? So if it was possible in those days, why not in these days? In particular, we need a rule that prevents that a national government or even a central bank decision should prevail over its international responsibility, which is what happens today when we talk about interest rates, movement, exchange rates, etc. Let me remind that already Article 4 of the International Monetary Fund's statute reads, I quote, "Each member must avoid to manipulate the exchange rates in order to acquire a competitive, unfair advantage over other members." That was already stated in 1944, and since then, nothing has happened on that sense. By the way, this is one way to cope with the phenomena of pecuniary externalities which the present financial system is generating at a very rapid speed. A second novelty in this quarter of a century is that the economic machinery continues to operate in an intolerable, unfair way. Inequality has become endogenous. That is the phenomenon. In the past, inequality always existed, but it was exogenous. The novelty of today that it has become endogenous to the system. And this generates not only economic cost, such as speculative bubbles, decreasing rates of investment, consumption distortions, etc., but above all social and human cost. And it is a fact that an inequality rate exceeding a certain threshold reduces health and increases the mortality rate of people. In recent years, neither economic theory nor empirical evidence has been able to confirm the presumed trade-off between equality and efficiency, as it was exposed in the famous classic work by Arthur Okun in 1975. But still, inequality, it's possible to cope with it. In other words, there are a comprehensive set of policies that could bring about a genuine shift in the distribution of income that is possible. In other words, to reduce inequality, we have to go beyond placing new taxes on the wealthy to fund existing programs. That is not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient. We need fresh ideas. We need now policies in particular, in my opinion, in 5 areas: technology, employment, social security, the sharing of capital, and taxation. Above all, we need to go against the common arguments and the excuses for inaction, that intervention will shrink the economy, that globalization makes action impossible, and that new policies cannot be afforded. All these cannot be proved, are not true. A third novelty has to do with the fact that the scaffolding of present-day market system tends to erode some of the values that sustain our civilization. Indeed, the process of creative destruction in Schumpeter's sense applies not only to firms and to inputs of production, but also to the very values that gave rise to market capitalism in the first place, a point which was raised in the previous panel. In particular, the present market system tends to empower the strong over the weak, and to make people believe that greed, as Jeffrey said in his presentation, is the appropriate way of incentivizing economic agents and achieve the best results. He quoted Manville, the fable of the beast. Now we know that that statement is, objectively wrong, and many economists all over the world continue to believe, because it has been disproved even on economic grounds. A fourth element has to do with the fact that, as a consequence of the above, the libertarian model of social order, has increasingly taken the characteristics of a religion, since it posits an overarching goal for human life and seeks to pursue it on the basis of a specific concept of human being. This is a point at which Pope Francis is particularly interested in devoting his attention. The fact that this model of social order is, so to speak, competing with a religious dimension. One in this regard is reminded of the prophetic book by Walter Benjamin, published in 1921. The title was revealing, Capitalism as Religion. That was the title of his book, where Benjamin clarifies that capitalism shares to satisfy the same worries, anguish, and disquiet formerly answered by religion. Today, it seems to me that the masking of the ideological nature of the libertarian model of social order takes place in two ways. On the one hand, decisions with moral content are presented in technical terms. Let me give you an example. Human rights have to be limited for the sake of efficiency. We keep on hearing and reading here and there. On the other hand, technical arguments are rendered as genuine moral alternative. For instance, the market versus state alternative is presented as if it were an ideological question, when, as we know, it's a technical question, not an ideological. So I do believe that it is urgent to try to demask this ideological nature of the libertarian model of social order. Finally, let me touch briefly a fifth point. It has to do with the ecological transition, about which the last encyclical Laudato Si is particularly concerned. As we know, these are data more or less official, that at the world level, the amount of financial assets is $700,000 billion, $700,000 billion. And this is a figure which is 12 times more than the global GDP. Now, that is something unique. In 1980, the two figures were more or less the same. Global GDP was more or less the same as the total amount of financial assets. So the question is, in 35 years, we moved from 1 to 1 to 1 to 12. And what is disquieting is the fact that only 7% of that big amount goes to finance the real side of the economy, which is the best proof that finance today has become self-referential. But finance existed since ages. As we know, were the Franciscans in the 14th and 15th century who started financial instruments like pawn banks and others. So it's not the problem of finance, because finance is necessary. Finance is important. What is this form of proliferation, self-referential nature of finance, etc.? And that it's important because, as the Pope mentioned, not in Laudato Si, but in another speech, the present Pope, if we want to enact ecological transition, we need to devote a percentage of these financial assets to finance the traverse. The traverse means the passage from the old equilibrium to a new equilibrium. So when people say it is difficult or impossible to move in the direction of an ecological transition, that is a lie, because resources are available. What is necessary is to move from the 7% I was talking about to at least 15%. That would be enough to finance ecological transition. I conclude by saying one last word concerning the contribution of John Paul II to the theme of peace, which is really remarkable in my opinion, because what John Paul II, by the way, he's the Pope who invented the expression structures of sin. The extraction of sins, were coined by John Paul II. And he applied in particular to the peace argument. When he said, peace is possible, since war is an event, not a state of thing. In other words, war is not a permanent condition of human beings, although war can be very long. Second point, however, peace must be built, since it is not a spontaneous phenomenon. In other words, if we want peace, we need to establish institutions particularly aimed at this regard. And third point is today, the most urgent institution to generate or guarantee peace are those that involve human development, or better to say, human integral development. I think that we have many reasons to think on these elements, and so let me express once more my gratitude to Professor Jeffrey Sachs for his splendid and highly provocative presentation. Thank you.